Morning, everyone. We are going to tackle this week a headline from last week and talk a little bit about the pardon that President Biden granted to his son Hunter Biden. And take a look at we're not going to necessarily take a vote whether we like it or we don't like it. It's a Jewish audience, so we probably have multiple opinions. But we're going to take a look at the idea of a pardon, idea of how that may fit into the Jewish justice system, and then some of the ramifications, how that the Jewish sources might look at such an act. So let's dive right into last week's headline. This was reported all sorts of different places. President Biden pardons his son, Hunter Biden. Joe Biden pardoned his son, Hunter Biden, on Sunday night, a reversal for the president who repeatedly said he would not use his executive authority to pardon his son or commute his sentence. I believe the justice system, but as I've wrestled with this, I also believe raw politics has infected this process and it led to a miscarriage of justice. And once I made this decision this weekend, there was no sense in delaying it further. I hope Americans will understand why a father and a president would come to this decision. Biden said in his statement, the president issued a full and unconditional pardon for any offense Hunter Biden has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from January 1, 2014 through December 1, 2024, according to the White House statement. That was the pardon. So from a practical perspective, Hunter is now off scot-free. There had been no, doesn't matter if there are crimes from before January 2014, or that he may have committed starting December 2nd. It's a whole new ballgame. But that's it. It's over. Whatever guilty verdicts had been determined, that's what a presidential pardon is. As Andrew Hamilton wrote in Federalist number 73, source number 2. The criminal code of every country partakes so much of necessary severity that without an easy access to exceptions in favor of unfortunate guilt, justice would wear a countenance too sanguinary and cruel. Right? They just don't seem to write them like this anymore in terms of language and the like, but that was the godless or the greatness of our founding fathers. There you have Hamilton in Federalist 73. There's a need for a mechanism in place for sometimes the justice system gets it wrong. And when the justice system gets it wrong, there needs to be a mechanism in place. That mechanism is the presidential pardon. Almost in awareness that it sounds almost immediately, and we'll see this, explore this a little bit from the Jewish sources later, we have in Jewish law a concept called lifnim mishurat hadin. Lifnim mishurat hadin is translated as going beyond the application of the letter of the law. Sometimes this is utilized to describe people who behave and do more than is necessary. Sometimes that's the lifnim mishurat hadin. So you don't have to do something, but you do something you don't have to do. That's beyond the letter of the law. But sometimes you don't follow the explicit technical law for a view for a higher purpose. In the Talmud, when they talk about the idea of compromise, very often, and we've seen this in other classes before, if there's litigation between two parties, sometimes looking at it as an all or nothing, one side will win, one side will lose, will lead to some difficulty. The peshara, the idea of compromise, is viewed as the better legal outcome as opposed to the letter of the law. So Judaism has a concept. It doesn't really give us the rules always for how that would apply, but built into our constitutional system, we have a check and a balance. That's almost the way Hamilton is putting it in the Federalist, that there's sometimes a miscarriage of justice, and that's why you have to have this alternate path of going down in order to get the appropriate outcome, so that the outcome is not too, to use this terminology, cruel. So that's the idea of a pardon. That's the idea of it being built into the system. We'll start looking at some Jewish parallels and contrasts. Any questions, comments, reactions before we go down that path?
I think the only real partner we have is Hashem in the Jewish religion.
Okay, well, we'll have to see about that. This God works on God's level of justice, but in the human realm, you're not always going to have a divine statement or message or determination. It's being left up to the judicial system. And when and where might there be the opportunity to go beyond that determination is something that we're going to see. Obviously, God is the great pardoner, but God gave this world to us to implement on, and at least in the American system, there was the idea of the pardon. The one thing that stood out for me, and just in terms of the nature of this pardon, is often presidents at the end of their terms grant pardons or clemency and the like, and sometimes the pardon is granted to someone who has already served their time, and the pardon kind of rolls back the record. To some extent, there's an idea of, if you do the crime, you're going to have to serve the time. And then maybe a pardon is there for the reputation. When doing research on the subject, if you look at, different controversial pardons, you encounter, for example, Mark Rich, Clinton pardon at the end of his term, and let a whole, host of different issues. One of the issues that dealt with there was, how to view the philanthropy of someone who may have benefited in an improper way, but then he was pardoned. How does that look? If we were giving writ from the past headlines, maybe we can go down that path. But here it's the idea of the pardon is forestalling or eliminating any type of punishment for a crime. So it just stands out that there's one thing for a pardon to rehabilitate, but here the pardon is coming before the ostensible sentence would attempt to do that rehabilitation, and it's being eliminated by the pardon. Again, fitting in within what Hamilton points out. If there's the viewpoint that there's really this is an exceptional situation where we're worried about a miscarriage of justice, that's what the pardon is there for. All right, but here, what kind of Jewish parallels might we find? So source number 3.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I'm curious, are there any participants to this Zoom who would not have done what Biden did? I certainly, as a father, would have done the same thing.
Okay, that's theoretical question. I think there clearly is, and I think we'll see some reaction later on. I think there's an understanding of the emotion and the protection for one's child. Our job is not to go down the emotional analysis path, or doing what we would do to save our children. But what is the concept of a pardon? And does Jewish law or tradition have anything similar? And look at it favorably or unfavorably. There are plenty of things that Jewish law looks at unfavorably that unfortunately many people do anyway. So, we live in a real world, but we're going to try to understand what, does the Jewish tradition open up space for the potential pardon, or give any guidance of when it should or shouldn't be implemented? Are there cases where it's available for the taking or for the implementation on the part of the person who's given authority to pardon? I think all of those issues, emerge from the headline. That's why we're talking about it. But I think no one's going to disagree that no parent wants to see their child, all things being equal, put in jail, even if they're guilty. That's what familial connections are. Look, it opens up a larger discussion. What about the parent of the criminal? Right? I'm sure many of us are following the case of the assassination of the United Healthcare Company CEO, and brazen execution and manhunt, and now they have the suspect. What about that person's parents? Do they want him off the hook too? Maybe they might, because they're the parents of a child. So I think that's only human and natural. We're looking at the framework and the scaffolding and some of the sources that Jewish tradition may have that speak towards it. And as you're right, Al, you can't judge a person until you walk a mile in their shoes. But doesn't mean we can't try and see whether it's in line with certain approaches the Jewish tradition has, or certain sources there are. And just like there will be some people who may validate the decision, many will not validate the decision. I don't think it's a political comment to note that most of the coverage after the pardon was putting side by side all of the comments when President Biden said he would never do such a thing versus now he did such a thing. Look, this is why our sages in Pirkei Avot say, "Chachamim hizaru b'divreichem." Watch out for your words. You say something, you do the opposite. People are going to hold you to it, regardless of your motivation or justification. So I think that's definitely a piece of it. But let's now look to the Jewish parallel within the Jewish justice system. This idea of showing compassion for the guilty, and where there are opportunities for making exceptions to the law. So source number 3, Devarim 19:13, show no pity on him. You shall purge the guilt of the innocent blood from Israel, and it will go well with you. So there's this is dealing with a criminal case. This is dealing with a capital case that a person was murdered and was found guilty and was sentenced to death. And Rashi presents the rabbinic view on this source: for show no pity on him, that you shall not say the first person has already been killed, right? The murderer murdered, so one person's dead. Why should we kill this also, so that 2 Israelites will be killed? So this is also really a death penalty source also. Maybe you will oppose the death penalty here because, wait a second, you got 1 dead person. Why do you want 2 dead people? That's not justice. That's 2 dead people. Nevertheless, the Torah says, no, this is about purging the criminal act from here. That's what's going on. Ramban looks at it a little bit differently as not just a specific verse addressing a specific case, but in general. Similarly, in the case of plotting witnesses, he commanded that we have no pity on them, thinking that because nothing that had yet been done to the accused, therefore we should not punish them, or perhaps the strictness is due to the prevalence of their danger. Basically, Ramban sees this verse as a reminder that there are all sorts of mitigating factors, right? Let's say the criminal, the specific case in Jewish law that Nachmanides Ramban mentions has to do with let's say there were witnesses who plotted to do something, but they were not able to accomplish their plot. So it was almost for the crime of conspiring to do something but not doing something. So you might think, says the Ramban, that hey, they didn't do anything wrong in the end. They thought about doing something wrong, but the crime didn't lead to any type of damage. So maybe we can let them off the hook. No, justice. The only way to maintain the order of a system is to employ justice, and sometimes this means show no pity. Okay, they didn't do anything so terrible. They didn't cause any damage or harm or bodily injury or the like, and so the crime was a bloodless crime. No, that doesn't matter. You still have to apply justice in the strict letter of the law against it, so that, because otherwise you'll have a society that is corrupted or goes downhill. So this just in terms of conceptually, when you look at the justice system, is it meant to punish? Or is it meant to maintain order? And sometimes the punishment is what helps maintain the order, even if it seems more strict than necessary. So that's one. That would be, Hamilton, the Federalist says sometimes the courts have a terrible result and it has to be corrected. Maybe Jewish law says no. The justice system is all that we have, and we should not deviate from that system. Okay. That being said, there is a major exception that's made in that system because we talked before the idea of pshara, which is not really a criminal concept; it's more in a monetary interpersonal concept. But even within the system of law, there's something called the mishpat hamelech. There's the idea that the king has a certain role within the justice system that goes extrajudicially. So look at source number 6, Rambam, my mom.
$61 billion plus $112 billion. That's just Tesla. That's not SpaceX. That's not XAI, by the way, where he's now got a $50+ billion valuation going up from there.
Yeah, you focus on is just on Israel.
That's it. Just one.
Sorry about that. technical difficulty here. The
So many times, and Optimus, the robot, only going to be videos of the robot. Again, remember, any video gets wrong, anything we can do, they can do better. And Jensen's most recent talk with the video.
give me 1 second. There we go.
They used to be able to even have the get received. But they can reason
All right, sorry about that. Maimonides in source number 6 with the laws of kings and wars talks about the king, a murderer against whom the evidence is not totally conclusive, who was not warned before he slew his victim, or even who was observed by only one witness, and similarly an enemy who had inadvertently killed one of his foes. The king is granted license to execute them and to improve society according to the needs of the time. He may execute many on one day, hang them, and leave them hanging for many days in order to cast fear into the hearts and destroy the power of the wicked of the earth. So you have here the idea of the king. Now, it's a little bit of a bloody example, but you have here the idea of the king being able to impose a sentence in order to protect society. The case given that there's a murderer who will go free without the king's involvement, or a murderer for whom there's not enough evidence to convict and execute, the king is allowed to do what is necessary. The king's also allowed to take steps that would go beyond the last sentence where it talks about leaving the body hanging. It's one of the rules in the Torah says if you hang the person as a form of execution, you can't leave the body out. You have to treat the body respectfully. So what Maimonides is mentioning is the idea that, let's say the king wants to leave the body hanging as an example. This is what happens to murderers. This is what happens to people who harm society. This idea of the Mishpat HaMelech, the king has the right and authority in extraordinary times to take extraordinary measures.
But the king thought of himself as an emissary of God. I'm not sure if I felt that way.
Unclear, what the king thinks. This is not really about a divine or a religious concept. This is about a societal concept, and the king has that authority. He's not invoking the name of God doing this. He's invoking what he feels is needed for the society. Now, this doesn't give him free license to do anything at all times. Rambam himself mentions this. The idea of it's actually a technical rule. There's a idea in Jewish law of erechin, valuation. So let's say a person says, I give my value as a donation to the temple. So in that case, the Torah and the Talmud have various rules. So let's say someone says, I give the value of someone who's been convicted of murder and will be executed. I give that person's value to the temple. So someone would say, well, that person doesn't have much value because his life is about to end. But the Rambam there says, no, not necessarily, because the king could pardon the person. Just like the king could execute when there's not enough evidence, the king could also pardon after the Beit Din has deemed for execution. And so we're entering the idea that Mishpat HaMelech, the king has the authority in situations to execute, and the king has license sometimes to pardon when the court decides to execution. Now, this is not viewed as something that can be done arbitrarily. As Rabbi J. David Bleich notes in an analysis of this within the concept of capital punishment, source number 8, right? This is really, he may suspend laws of evidence only as an emergency measure.
Rabbi,
Yes,
this is about Jews only, right?
we're talking about a Jewish king, in terms
And
of
a Jewish murderer or criminal.
Well, generally speaking, I guess the loop would seem to be only talking about within the Jewish community. Mishpat HaMelech, though, seems to say you can do whatever Mel Brooks said. It's good to be the king.
Mhm.
So there's really, the extrajudicial authority of the king. Through the analysis of the Rabbi Gershuni in source number 8, that Rabbi Black quotes, is that the king can take steps necessary for maintaining law and order and justice being implemented or applied as an emergency measure, however the king sees fit. So there could be non-Jewish impact. Usually speaking, we're talking about like the closed loop of a Jewish community. But the idea of a king being able to exceed the authority of the courts to condemn and to pardon, does give us a certain template for going beyond what the law would normally implement. And this Mishpat HaMelech can serve as a precedent. It might be able to be applied to other rulers, because we're going to see, we know that there is a idea of saying a blessing when meeting a king, a non-Jewish king. There's if you see a Jewish king, there's a bracha that God gave as source number 9, Shechalak mikvodo lireyav. We recognize God has shared his authority in this world with Jewish kings, or even a Gentile king that God gave from his honor to flesh and blood. We recognize, right, this is blessings that they don't teach you in Hebrew school because you hardly ever recite them, right? There's a blessing to be said over a Torah scholar or a or someone with great wisdom in non-Torah wisdom, right? There's a blessing on a king. Okay, so if there's a blessing on a king, there's a blessing to be said on a Gentile king. What is that? Does that mean King Philip? Does that mean the king of Morocco? Does that, what about countries that don't have kings that have presidents? What about the president? Is there a bracha to be said on the president? And this is something that has been addressed, in terms of what, is there, it kind of brings to mind, what bracha do you say on the czar? May the Lord keep the czar far away from us, right? That's the Fiddler on the Roof line. But maybe there is a bracha on the czar in terms of the fact that we recognize that when there are powerful individuals who have control over people and countries, that they are emissaries of God. They are akin to, they've been elevated in a religious framework, just like if they're Torah scholars or knowledgeable individuals who have who are very wise, they're also partners with God in this world. And it seems that the king, whether Jewish or not Jewish, is part of this, has a certain role that's worthy of recognition, right? Well, it's called, the blessing is that recognition, of that religious recognition. A king is deserving of religious recognition. And it seems that it comes from their ability to have, to make for their word to be done, right? Their word is law when it comes to the king. So if we're talking about that, Judaism recognizes that for the most part, we need justice. We need justice, not just to punish, but to maintain society. But we give that exception, that exclusion, that special lane for the king, for the Mishpat HaMelech, in extraordinary circumstances to do what is necessary. And that Mishpat HaMelech includes the ability to condemn to death and to pardon. And we recognize that in the non-Jewish world, there's a parallel for this in terms of the king. Maybe pardon is part of that. And then the question is, we're going to take a look at. So, from a Jewish perspective, from the legal perspective, is the president akin to a king in this respect? So, what's your initial knee-jerk reaction? Is the president akin to a king in terms of that ability to control things or impact on the legal system? Any thoughts?
Absolutely not.
Okay, that was a little bit
Quick.
equivocal. All right, any other thoughts? So I think many, as we'll see, we'll start to see that it, on some level, absolutely not, because the president is elected, right? The president
Right.
can be impeached. The president can be impeached multiple times, right?
This country is based on a system of justice and fairness.
All right.
Yeah.
So the subject, the question has come up from a Jewish law perspective, just in terms of if a person gets to meet the president. Also, Jewish law recognizes to honor kings, Jewish kings and non-Jewish kings, and to go out to greet them and to show them respect, pay the respect. It's like when the king goes by, all the subjects come out and pay their respect. So the question was raised, at least in a theoretical perspective, about heads of state. And if the Queen of England is visiting, should you go should you go? Or the question was asked if the president is visiting, is there a religious positive in going? And of course, whether or not the blessing over the king is said over, also said over the president. So when looking at this, so that we said that there's a blessing to be recited over non-Jewish kings. When discussing that, the Mishnah Berurah, right, the Chafetz Chaim commentary on the Shulchan Aruch Code of Jewish Law, source 10, when he talks about shiltonim she'ein ol melech aleihem lishanos divreihem v'dan v'horeg b'mishpat nivarech aleihem. He says it doesn't have to be only a king; it can be any ruler who has the ability to sentence to death. V'al hasarim shemimena hamel shemimana hamelech b'chol ir v'ir tov v'yashar levarech below shem u'malchus. If you have another official, if the number one person has that authority but appoints governors or the like, then you might want to say the blessing, but you can't say God's name. You can recognize their authority, but it doesn't have a divine imprimatur or recognition. So Mishnah Berurah is saying, if you have the ability to execute or pardon, you're a king. Otherwise, you're not. Okay. Rabbi Menashe Klein, who's living more into the 20th century, he was asked the question, and it's al davar hashela yitzarach levar birchas malachim al governor mimedinos biartzos habris. Governor. What about a governor? So leaving aside the Mishnah Berurah, who would seem to say absolutely not, he was asked, what about saying a bracha on the governor? So he starts addressing it and says, look, you have to, the Jewish law, we've always talked about praying for the well-being of the country. Government is what keeps law and order, and you should show respect to it. And we know that the precedent for Jews who live in different countries, he uses the term duchas, kind of like a duchas, a duke. Jews would always, show respect. He acknowledges also that Jews were often living in fear of the anti-Semitic overlords of their countries. But many of these people that they did not have authority to execute or pardon, and the blessing wouldn't apply. Well, if he's al governor, this is the end of the third line. Nami yeshul varashar biyadu lahamis ulachios. He says governors. I guess, but Rabbi Klein thought certain governors had the ability to execute or to pardon. And he says, now, we don't have the death penalty in that state. It could have been New York State when he was writing. Well, what about even the president? He says the president, you can say a bracha, he's in charge of the entire government, he can pardon. The governor, they may think they're powerful, but they're not powerful enough to warrant the blessing. So he begins to raise the possibility the president is akin to the king. The king has mishpat hamelech, can employ royal justice, which goes extrajudicially. Jewish law seems to be concerned with regards to whether they can execute or pardon, but they're talking about pardoning from a death penalty, right? That's the idea. If you have life and death, is you can pardon or commute someone's execution, stop their execution, then you do have a little bit of the power in life and death. And so certainly the idea of a pardon in a criminal case would apply to Mishpat HaMelech. For the most part, source number 12, talks about nowadays in terms of the general approach to presidents and kings and governors is the idea that it raises Rosie's point that it's really the people who decide, because the people decide. Last line about he talks about the king, the president is a representative of the people. At the same time, he does note that laws in the country, they may be passed by Congress, but a law requires a signature of a president. And so he kind of, on the one hand, the president requires the people, but from a technical point of view, the people require the president, the law requires the president. So he introduces that variable into the powers of the presidency, right? They always talk about what's the pocket veto or something, or sometimes, the idea is that the president doesn't sign something, they talk about recess appointment. They talk about different types of abilities the president has to impact law, even when it's not necessarily voted on or imposed from Congress. So it seems that Jewish tradition treats the president, certainly a president who has impact on law or laws becoming laws, or if you have the ability to commute or pardon, clemency in a death sentence, that rises to the level of what's considered a king in Jewish law. Therefore, the president has mishpat melech, and therefore, maybe one of the Jewish powers of the presidency is to pardon. That's not something that there's no check or balance against that mishpat melech from a Jewish perspective. Now, whether it's
edict, like when the president does something that is not necessarily lawful, he can do an edict. And
right, you have executive powers. The president is unique. As Rosie said initially, the president is elected by the people. Once elected, there's certain constitutional powers and things that the president can do. If we put that through a Jewish lens, looks a little bit like Mishpat HaMelech, and therefore, even from a Jewish perspective, the president may be the equivalent of a non-Jewish king. Kings have Mishpat HaMelech. You don't have to like it, but there is that power of the pardon or extrajudicial authority that Judaism recognizes that the monarch or sovereign may possess. Look, we know that there's a power of pardon built into the presidency. It's allowed. But we see now that there may be a Jewish parallel and a Jewish lens to look at it as well. But what about it can be done? But what about should it be done? What does this say about justice if you can take someone who's guilty of something and say no, they don't have to serve their sentence?
Also, if Zenogea ba memshala head, then it becomes
that may add another level of complexity, but the baseline question is the same. What does it say when you pardon someone and let them get away? This is the get out of jail free card in Monopoly, right? The fact that, like Al said before, the fact that there's a connection, a familial connection, makes it more understandable. But in terms of looking at this through the prism of what does this say about justice, if this can be the end result of a particular case, that a person who's guilty now gets off scot-free. And so, I think that this is not the system of law or the legality or the technical, but the concept of justice. How is that harmed or impacted by the idea of a pardon? And I think there's a couple of Jewish sources that contribute to this as well. Source number 13, you shall not render an unfair decision, do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich, judge your kin fairly. This is the idea. We know that there's certainly an aspirational element to justice, that it all be done equitably and fairly. Rambam Maimonides on this topic. Source 14, a judge may not adjudicate the case of a friend. This applies even if the person is not a member of his wedding party or one of his more intimate companions. Similarly, he may not adjudicate the case of one he hates. This applies even if the person is not his enemy and one whose misfortune he seeks. Instead, the two litigants must be looked upon equally in the eyes and in the hearts of the judges. If the judge does not know either of them and is not familiar with their deeds, this is the fairest judgment that could be. Right? There's a certain aspirational justice here. And again, a pardon is not a judge, but the idea of maintaining a system that people feel the justice system is fair is a Jewish religious value. So now let's look at some of the reaction to Biden's pardon. Source number 15, Noah Feldman, professor of law at Harvard Law School. Hunter Biden's pardon is understandable but wrong. No government action implicates a raw motion more than a president pardoning a family member. Seen from a human perspective, Joe Biden's decision to pardon his sole surviving son, Hunter, whom he has always loved to a fault, is about the most understandable action of his whole presidency. Yet the unprecedented act of a president pardoning his son is also a kind of tragedy for the republic, precisely because the only real criticism will come from Trump and his loyalists. In a day or two, the event will be forgotten. That's not where we want our country to be. We need to do everything we can to resist the slide to a banana republic status. That includes recognizing the fundamentally troubling reality of a president using the emperor-like power of pardon for his own child, even when the decision is fully understandable as the action of a public servant who is vulnerable and human in his paternal love. I think that's an extension of basically what the Torah is asking us to do with regards to keeping a fair justice system. It could be allowed, but what does it do to the system as a whole? And I think this is why we saw negative reactions from judges themselves, right? Source 16, the judge who presided over Hunter Biden's federal tax case in Los Angeles reviewed President Biden on Tuesday for pardoning his son this week, saying he misrepresented the facts of his son's criminal case when he announced the move. In a brief order, U.S. Judge Mark Scarsi also called out the president for maligning law enforcement and the justice system as rationale for issuing the clemency. And the judge even indicated that part of the pardon may be unconstitutional. The blunt criticism of a sitting president for a federal judge adds the condemnation by both Republicans and Democrats of the president's extraordinary decision Sunday to give the full and unconditional pardon after repeatedly saying he wouldn't. But the idea of that it is a something that weakens the justice system, and to malign the justice system, that's also part of the problem. And source 17, by choosing to put his family first, 82-year-old president who had pledged to restore fractured public trust in the nation's institutions has raised new questions about his already teetering legacy. This is a bad president that could be abused by later presidents and will sadly tarnish his reputation. Leaving the person of Biden aside for a moment, bad precedent that could be abused by later presidents. These are all things that weaken the legal system and as opposed to the aspiration to maintain a fair and just legal system. He added that while he could sympathize with Hunter Biden's struggles, no one is above the law, not a president, not a president's son. Those are all sentiments that fit into what the Torah is aspiring for the justice system to maintain. And that seems to be, leaving one's political views aside, that seems to be something that is emerging in the discussion, which makes sense to emerge in the discussion. What does it say about the justice system? We know that the president has a certain role, just like we know there's Mishpat HaMelech. The president has can have a share in that. At the same time, it has to be balanced with what that does to the overall justice system in total. And that's why some pardons slip by and some pardons get attention. When they get attention, they harm the overall ability, authority, or stability of a justice system. Then that's where things become difficult and problematic. And just in terms of going back, this was an article that was written a while ago, it was addressing clemency. Source number 18, Rabbi Gill student. Man-made laws suffer from greater limitations than divine laws. The Rambam teaches that the Torah's laws cannot account for every case, and therefore some people will suffer under the Torah, such as the classical Aguna whose husband is missing. However, man-made laws are subject to great imperfection. Clemency is a guard against poor legislation that fails to consider the potential consequences. It allows for mercy when the law overreaches. Additionally, we have to take into account not just differences between Torah and civil legislation, but also judicial process. The Torah's judicial process differs from most Western court systems in many ways. In particular, Jewish court almost never convicts a criminal case on a biblical level. The standard for evidence is very high, as we saw above regarding the warning requirement. In such a system, clemency for the rare convict would threaten to eliminate all punishment on a biblical level. American courts, on the other hand, convict and punish criminals frequently. Clemency has a much more limited impact on such a system. So there is, recognizing the fact that, and he makes the distinction between sometimes the Jewish justice system based on Torah laws, which are divine or religious in nature, especially when we're talking about the capital cases, which hardly ever involved a conviction and a condemnation towards execution. But he says, look, human laws can be, humans are fallible, and mistakes can be, mistakes happen. And interestingly enough, in a human system, right, clemency has a much more limited impact on such a system because we're all human. He's human, we're human, the beat goes on. So it's just kind of an interesting, on the one hand, maybe we recognize where the pardon, what the pardon is and the ability to pardon. We recognize from a Jewish perspective, there is an aspirational level of always applying The court cases have to always be applied, and there shouldn't be exceptions. There are extrajudicial situations and settings beyond the court system, and for much of Jewish history, we haven't really been following the courts. Who had been often an extrajudicial implementation. Maybe that applies over to the president, recognizing there should still be the responsibility to maintain the systems in place. But man-made systems are fallible, and mistakes happen, and more mistakes will happen, and we'll probably go beyond it. And I think that, but we saw that we can understand where it comes from, the familial love. We can understand how it's legal based on a system, but we still are hopeful that the system should really be more important than anyone's personal considerations. So some food for thought and some scaffolding from a Jewish perspective on the recent pardon. Questions, comments, reactions?
In this person's case, it is an issue of the paper trail where he has been part of issues with the son. So it becomes, in my mind, open.
Look,
but of course, presidents have privilege for that. Absolutely, get that.
That's I guess voters beware. You're gonna get the whole package.
And b'chol ma'aminim we say shehu levado hamamlich melachim v'lo hamalucha. It's we have to. There's a bigger picture involved here. So
right. Well, I think you see that at the within students' comments. You can read the whole article on his blog. The idea that pardons are less relevant, or would seem to make less sense when you have a real solid system, right? Like he says, capital Torah law, right? If you ever got to an execution, it was probably because you did it right. When it comes to human law, right? Substitute malachim and malucha for authority and judgment. And yeah, that's definitely appropriate.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Republicans and many people point out that Hunter was convicted of 3 felony tax offenses and 3 felonies related to gun purchases. And we all know that there are degrees of felonies. There's murder is a felony, and these offenses are also felonies. On the other hand, there was a situation in this country where insurrectionists attacked our capital, and many consider that to be the most serious crime ever committed. And nevertheless, by the way, some of these insurrectionists were screaming 6 million was not enough. Obviously, many of these insurrectionists were anti-Semites. And nevertheless, as we know, Trump has said he wants to pardon these people because they are patriots. So
I'll say, Al, you're very consistent in that somehow a class nothing to do with Trump ends with Trump. Good job.
Thank you.
Those
are
right.
Rabbi, only the facts. That's all I want.
Exactly. So, all right. We'll pick it up, please God, next week.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good one.